everyone. My name is Héctor Armienta. I'm a composer and also the artistic director of Opera Cultura. And I'm very happy to be joined today by wonderful composer Nicolás Benavides. How are you, Nicolás?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. And I call him Nick. I think that's the kind of that's what most people call you. Is that right?
Yeah, most of my friends and family call me Nick, but yeah, I generally love my full name when it comes to being on the score. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So just Nick. Yeah. This program, just to also share with you, is a program called Los Revolucionarios, and it's a program devoted to the work of Latinx artists changing the face of opera on stage and off stage. And that's the purpose of this interview, is really to talk about the work of Latinx artists, such as this wonderful composer, Nicolás Benavides. So Nick, let's just start right with some questions. So tell me, how did you first get introduced to opera?
Yeah, so I'm a super late bloomer when it comes to opera. I did not know opera existed until I was probably about 19 years old. So I grew up playing with my grandpa. He's an accordionista, so like rancheras, corridos. I played some mariachi music sometimes, and I played in the jazz ensembles in school, and I sang in musicals. And I honestly, like all good stories, it was for a stupid reason. I liked a girl, and she invited me to start singing, and then she didn't like me back, but then I kept singing. And the next thing I know, I got this invitation through my dorm freshman year to go to this opera. And I thought, oh, I'll go to the opera, like, why not? I'll meet some friends. I didn't make any friends, but it didn't really matter because they sat us in the front row of the San Francisco Opera. And I was just looking down. It was the Magic Flute, which is a silly opera, but it didn't matter. For me, it was the spectacle of the thing. At the orchestra, the singers, the costumes, and I was just like, my God, this is amazing. I don't care how stupid this story is. I want to do this. And so I'm one of those naive people who is young and naive enough to look at this big giant stage and thought, I think I could fit in there. I think I'll do that too. So
Yeah.
here I am today.
Yeah, well, Magic Flute is it's a very comedic opera. It doesn't make sense on a lot of levels, but everybody loves it. It's just the music. So, Mozart, how can you beat Mozart? But and you've also, from what I know about you, you've also have done a lot of work in symphonic. You've created a lot of symphonic work. You also create, and I don't know how to describe, but some work using I call it sound design or music concrete, or you introduce different sound elements into your work too. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I work with electronics. I'm always hesitant to call myself an electroacoustic composer, but I've just keep working in electronics, so I might have to acquiesce and start taking on that title.
Yeah. Well, it's great that you have this, variety of kind of work that you create. But we're going to focus, if we can, today on opera. So tell me your current, some of the projects that you worked on before, and then we'll talk about some of your new projects.
Sure. So I've wanted to write opera since I became a composer, but like most people, you don't realize how much effort writing opera actually is. And it took me a number of years. So I wrote a lot of songs and stuff. But my first big break in opera came when I was chosen for the Washington National Opera's American Opera Initiative, which I really think is like the gold standard in this country for young, aspiring opera composers and librettists to participate in. And I was super lucky. They chose 3 teams, 3 composers, 3 librettists. And they had us being mentored by Jake Heggie and Gene Shear, the legendary opera team, who of course made a variety of operas, including Moby Dick, and they had the Christmas Story opera just a few seasons ago at San Francisco. And we just pitched operas. They taught us it from scratch. They said, okay, you're going to pitch stories, you're going to write opera, you're going to produce something. And that's through that process we wrote Pepito, which is a comedic opera about a dog adoption, kind of gone wrong, but kind of gone right. It was a situational opera, but it was my first taste, was writing a comedy. Soon after that, I got a commission to write Tres Minutos, which word on the street is there might be a performance coming up. I don't know how public that is or not. Hector knows. I don't know if we can talk, but and that's an opera that I loved making. It was like a dream next step project for 3 singers, 6 instruments, and it's about 2 siblings who are separated by the border. Not a comedy. I think people who saw Pepito were like, are like, what's going on here? Sort of completely oscillating. I think there's one joke in the entire opera, but it's a huge emotional thing. And then I have other projects in the works. I should mention, Tres Minutos was commissioned by Music of Remembrance, Minna Miller, artistic director, and premiered in Seattle and San Francisco. I'd love to credit the commissioner. And then coming up, I'm working on an opera about civil rights activist and American hero Dolores Huerta, called Dolores, and with librettist Marilla Martin Cook. These were all with librettist Marilla Martin Cook, I should add. And that has been commissioned by West Edge Opera in Oakland, and it's a full-length opera with symphony and a chamber orchestra, full cast, opera chorus, and that's in progress. I was doing some writing on that this morning, and I am so excited. The opening is coming along. It's been hard to find a way to capture Dolores Huerta, who's just like in the Chicano civil rights movement is like a legend.
Yeah, she's huge, of course. Yeah, she's a huge icon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about so Pepito. Pepito is about it's how long is the length? It's about less than half an hour. Is that right?
It's about 22 minutes. Yeah.
22 minutes. Yeah, and I think that's how I think we knew each other before, but that's how I sort of got introduced to your work as an opera composer. And I've listened to it, and it's really a wonderful piece. It's very comedic. And there's even a little, and there's an animated, is it animated version, right, of the
There's
work?
an animated scene from it.
Okay, thank you. To animate the whole thing.
I know, right? We got to get a grant. That was through New Opera West. Emily Tebow's idea. She did knockout job. Just amazing.
Yeah, and I've seen it. I loved it. But it's just wonderful, just in terms of the musical color, the writing of the vocal lines. Just it's wonderful. So well done on that. And Tres Minutos is, I've heard that too, and I think that's a very powerful piece. I think it's, I didn't see the performance they did in San Francisco, but I'm familiar with the music, and it is a really wonderful and well written work, and a very powerful story. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, well, tell me about sort of the next question. I kind of hinted a little bit before we came online. Before we recorded this, was the question of language, because as you know, I have always mostly written in sort of Spanglish, right? Because that's, I'm Chicano, and that's how we grew up, and that's kind of the community that I usually write for. But I've had more interest lately in writing work that's more just in Spanish, and it's it's an interesting question about language and what we write in and you're Mexican American like I am, but I know in New Mexico, because I have a lot of friends there now.
Norteño, north of the border. But yeah, I mean the history is it's just complicated. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. But so what are your thoughts about the language of the libretto, being that your work is mostly about the Latinx experience, cultural experience? And I know you speak Spanish fluently. But anyway, why don't you share your thoughts? I'm curious.
And that's a really good multi-level question. I'll do my best to answer succinctly, but it's
gotta make them interesting.
I know. Use at different angles. I mean, it's really, that question is the core of what I am learning to discover about myself. I'm going to answer broadly, then I'll try to drill into specific reasonings. But me as a product of the United States, I was born here. My family, in a weird way, is in this brackish water in between zone, which encompasses my artistic output. Right, my family's from New Mexico, has been for forever. Ethnically, we are Chicanos. In fact, our cousins are Chicano civil rights activists. Like, we are part of the movement. But at the same time, like, I don't have any living family, well, that I know of in Mexico proper. So I generally don't call myself Mexican American, even though by all intents and purposes, culturally, I am. And so there's this confusion, there's this discovery of who am I? And I think a big part of what I do when I write music is discovering who am I? How do I fit in? I fit in culturally more with Mexican American culture than I do with American culture, even though by years you would think that I would fit in more with American culture. My family spoke Spanish through my grandparents as their first language. even though everybody was born and raised in New Mexico, right? The people, this is a trope. People say, we didn't move across the border moved across us, like multiple times, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, when I think about what I write, it's really not like an answer of this is what I am. This is, you're always looking at, in any of my works, me in the process of discovering who am I, who is my family. And that's what the practice of culture really is, is me engaging, me participating. And sometimes I discover something great. Sometimes I don't discover something great. Sometimes I feel satisfaction with where I landed. Sometimes I don't. But that's what I think makes it interesting for me. It's why I want to keep exploring this. To the point of language, I speak Spanish. I love to, but we're in this in between, right? Like I was born with my name without an accent, but just like Cesar Chavez has now become in the vernacular Cesar Chavez, even though he would have said Caesar back then and does in interviews. I've begun to pronounce my name Nicolás for the past few years because I like the sound of it. It feels like a reclamation. And this goes into the language part of things. I would love to write opera in Spanish. I don't have a Spanish language collaborator, and though I speak, unlike you, I'm not a acclaimed librettist as well as composer. It's not a skill set that I have. Maybe I should cultivate it. But the librettists I work with are English speakers, and so we write stories that focus on the English language. And I'll contribute some Spanish phrases, or I'll be like, I think this should be in Spanish. But it's always from a story point of view of like, okay, if this line is in Spanish, will the audience still understand what's going on? If the answer is yes, and it serves well, then we'll go with it. But it's really like on the spectrum of things. I love inserting Spanish. Spanish, as you know, is way more singable than English in so many
Absolutely.
respects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
who knows? I would love to do a Spanish language opera, and I would love to collaborate with an Hispanohablante on that, but
yeah.
to be determined.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I'll share with you sort of about Zorro. So, it is, sort of Spanglish, but some of the questions I get more so from people who are, not Latino or Hispanic is why, Hector, do you go back and forth? And as to reach a certain community. And in fact, when I was at the cast party, these young people, younger than you, and you're young compared to me, but we're like,
Yeah.
Hector, God, it's so great, you sort of validated how we speak at home and all of that. But I do get, and I am creating, for reasons, I'll explain in another video some point. I am creating a version just solely in Spanish because there is sort of an audience for it, and there are opera companies that prefer that. But it is interesting, when you are, Latino or Latinx, this whole question about language. And I think you're right, as you, creating art is an exploration of who you are and discovering something about yourself and these sort of bicultural roots. I think, well, let me go on to a question about more related to you. I'm just talking, but, New Mexican culture is different, from California culture, Chicano culture. When I go there, the folks there, say I'm Hispanic, not Mexican American, not Chicano. So how does that, if at all, influence the kind of projects that excite you, being that you're from New Mexico?
Yeah, I love that question too. I mean, for me, a lot of what I do, I specifically focus on, I generally on the umbrella term, but like the Latine experience in the United States. There are composers who do stories that are directly about like the Chicano movement stemming from Mexico. Although of course the Chicano movement is mostly an American thing, from the United States these days. But I really, really think about like what does it mean to be in this sort of in between zone? What does it mean to have one foot here, one foot there? In my case, what does it mean to be, part gringo and part pocho? Like I don't have both of my parents are Hispanic, to use the term from New Mexico, which is the only state that really uses it in a positive way, I would say. Every other state does not like that term. But you're right. People say Hispanic. Nobody says Latino in New Mexico. I say Latino for the rest of the country because I don't really want to talk about why we say that word.
But some people on the East Coast, they prefer Hispanic.
Yeah.
Artists that I've talked to. So it's just Hispanic on the East Coast. It's California's like, Latino, Latina, Chicano, Latinx. But anyway, these terms they change. So does Dolores, the project Dolores, and and she's a nationally, sort of national icon for the Latinx, Latino community, but also international. Talking about specifically about this upcoming work that you're doing. How do your sort of musical influences, maybe from New Mexico or elsewhere, are influencing sort of the themes and motifs and harmony? How are you? Where's your artistic well coming from?
I used to think about this a lot, like a lot, in a very nervous way of how am I going to do this? Up through about when I was composing Pepito, actually, about that time is when I flipped a switch. And something just changed in me, which was I realized that I am the product of my experiences. Like I'm not just some random composing machine that's going to compose whatever. And that whenever I write, and it comes out different every time, is going to be part of the New Mexican cultural experience, right? And that can vary wildly. Like people ask me this about Dolores all the time. And I am kind of a musical omnivore. Sometimes it's going to sound like big band music. Hey, I played in a jazz big band growing up. I also played corridos and rancheras with my grandpa. Sometimes you're going to get those beautiful thirds that sound like they're from, Mexico City. Sometimes you're going to hear some atonal music that I picked up in grad school. I mean, and I'm not trying to actively to do it at any point. It's just going to happen as it happens. I like Dolores is so far, it's kind of a big amalgamation. I think sometimes you might hear these sort of like flashes of light of what you might consider Southwestern music. But just like, Daniel Catan wrote like the great Italian composers, right? Like the bel canto style. But he's from Mexico, and all these things can come from different directions. So I'm just going to write what I write, and I'm going to reflect on it later. But I don't know. And sometimes I don't even know. Sometimes I write something, and someone says, "Oh man, that sounded like a Latin cabaret dance," and I was like, "Really? I thought I was writing like a Rachmaninoff style thing there." But whatever. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I'll run with it.
Yeah. So then so you're drawing from all these different influences, both from where you grew up and your training. So you're not necessarily trying to write a corrido or ranchero or music from something that Dolores might have heard.
Well, Dolores loved big band music, and she loved opera and ballet, but she mostly likes big band dance music. So,
Okay.
she's a dancer. She loved
Yeah.
Latin dance music too. But no, not explicitly. I'm
Yeah.
gonna write what feels right for the scene as I'm doing it, that conveys the emotion and the action, and I'm gonna be open to all of these things being available to me. And I think that's a strength for people like us, who have these feet in different places. Is like, at this moment, a corrido might serve her emotional state of mind really well, and if so, I'm gonna dip into it. Or maybe this sort of cloud-based John Corigliano type, Ghost of Versailles type music is going to suit it really well. And then I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Tres Minutos is like that. I
Yeah.
totally stole a bit from John Corigliano sometimes. And then I stole, and then I stole from Public
Influenced, influence, not style, you're
influence.
influenced.
This
Yeah.
is being recorded. I write that.
So I guess my last question to you is, um, as a Latinx artist, what do you feel your role is, um, in as a Latinx artist? Let's just leave it open.
What my role is?
Yeah, as an artist and as a person of color and as a Latinx individual, or do you not feel that that really needs any kind of designation or?
I have come to the conclusion as I've taught, so I teach a lot. I have students, and my students are really smart. They ask great questions, including when I was guest lecturing. So a student asked us, I was guest lecturing at the LA Phil Young Composers program a few weeks ago. And these students didn't even know me, but they were asking questions like this right off the bat. Really thoughtful kids. And I love these questions because they get me thinking. But I've come to the conclusion that I'm going to bifurcate who I am as an artist and then as an artist citizen. I think as an artist, my obligation is solely to myself, is to write things that I think are sincere, things that I think are genuine, and things that speak from my experience, things that only I can do. My obligation is to make something unique, even if it's just a little bit unique, but something that is unique in the world that only I could do from my experience. And that's why I write what I write. As an artist citizen, however, I think my obligation goes far deeper to the community. My obligation is to students, to mentorships. I think there is a higher standard sometimes, not sometimes, most times, for artists of color, in that these systems of progression, how the careers work, are built with a white male European's frame of mind, you know. And that means that students get excluded who are of color, and not just students, but people who ask for help. So I try to help whenever somebody reaches out and asks for advice, a letter of recommendation. Whenever I give talks, I try to elevate other artists of color. When I teach, I really try hard to bring in women artists of color specifically to give examples. And when I write music, when I write opera, I really want to write music that glorifies the experience that is what does it mean to be Latina from the Southwest. I think that's really important as an artist citizen to engage with all of that stuff, because otherwise, you know, what's to stop me from moving to northern New Mexico, becoming a hermit, sending out scores? I could do that, but I don't want to. I like talking to people about what it means to be me, and I like encouraging people. The last thing I'll say on that is, you know, you go to any composition program in the country, you look at any young composer program, and things are getting better. But the representation of young artists of color in these major institutions is really abysmal. And there are some programs that are trying to rectify that. I'm part of one right now with the Juilliard New York Philharmonic co-commission of the American Composers Forum. But like, these programs have to be built by administrators. So in the meantime, us artists, we have to do our very best to reach a hand out to help people and lift them up the same way that we had a hand that was reached out to us, you know, at least in my experience.
Well, congratulations, Nick, on all your successes. And I look forward to the upcoming presentation of Tres Minutos, which I'm sure we'll share to the community in general soon. And then also to Dolores. Now, Dolores is, when is the world premiere? Is it 2024?
So the world premiere is slated for 2024 with some as yet to be announced commissioning partners who are going to be helping us with the workshop. We're going to be workshopping the first half piano vocal. I'm saying it out loud so that I actually finish it on time in January. So I'll be in San Francisco.
I'll be in it's going to be in California, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll be sure to come. I'm looking forward to that.
I'll invite you. I think there's a presentation.
I definitely want to
I'll invite you.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Nick. And always a pleasure to talk to Nick, wonderful composer. I'm very excited about his work and more things on the horizon for him. And thank you for joining us for another episode of Los Revolucionarios. And we'll see you soon. All right. Bye-bye.